Well, hello again, everybody. Welcome back to a rousing new session of Storytime with Jack. In this story, even though it's a tad bit late now, I would like to recount an incredibly epic event that happened over 10 years ago. So sit back and enjoy as we delve into yet another wonderful story from my long-distant past. Negative 235X. 64Y, 247Z. This location, long since forgotten by man, has always held a very special spot in the hearts of those who have had the privilege of enjoying the most amazing and sublime exploit in 2B2T history. Our story begins, as most of my stories often do, 10 years ago in an ancient, distant era of 2B2T. The most important element of this story starts with the end of an era that you all are very likely unaware of. During this time, it was dominated by one singular hacked client, Notice, which at the time was the only public client available with any decent level of skill. This client had been solidly maintained for nearly a full year prior, but it had begun to wear on its maintainers' minds. The problem with a public client that was popular like Notice was back in that time, even though Notice's overall power was not nearly as effective as a modern-day client, was that everyone was always clamoring for more. This in turn created a pressure upon the creators of Notice, eventually leading to its demise. In July of 2013, with the 1.6 update, the creators of Notice decided to finally put the entire project to bed, and hopefully for good. The reaction to this news was rather mixed, and eventually the ensuing power vacuum created a huge demand for newer and better public clients. In the coming years, no one client would dominate the market as Notice had done in the past. However, one important feature of any client are the hacks that said client allows one to utilize. After the death of Notice, an arms race began, in which more and more clients would become publicly available with more and more unique hacks possible within their confines. Immediately after 2B2T had updated to 1.6, such a hack came to dominate all of 2B2T. This hack was widely known as the Spawn Teleport Glitch. As the name would imply, one could, from anywhere in the world at that time, teleport back to World Spawn in the blink of an eye. This sudden influx of mobility allowed for any number of groups, information, items, and ideas to exchange and proliferate at a moment's notice, all conveniently located at Spawn. This spot would quickly come to be known as STP. Over the years, the original world spawn had been lost amongst all the cobble, refuse, and destruction housed within the area of Spawn itself. This is due to the fact that the world spawn at that time had spawn protection enabled within 100 blocks of that location that would eventually come to be known as STP. This meant that the only changes that could be made to STP would be possible only through creating cobble via lava and water. As a result, STP became a huge death trap to all newer players and spawn constricted players alike. This created chaos, and after a long and arduous battle involving constant briefings as well as all the forces of nature themselves, Housemaster decided to permanently solve this issue by implementing a plugin that would randomize the spawn location of all new players. This would ensure that no one could ever be trapped within the 200 or so block area around World Spawn ever again. In addition to this action, Housemaster would also lift the spawn protection entirely. Eventually, this would lead to everyone forgetting where the original World Spawn location was. And as the server trudged on into late 2013, the popularization of the STP glitch would lead to the rediscovery of the original World Spawn location itself. The idea being that all worlds upon creation have one centralized location within a few hundred blocks of 0-0 that is considered to be true world spawn. All new players, as well as players without an assigned bed, would always default to spawning at this location. However, on 2B2T this has not been the case for a very long time. This means that a centralized world spawn holds no meaning. However, this exploit allowed a value of a centralized spawn location to now be utilized by players both new and old. The hack worked as follows. Anytime that a player moves, their client sends the server a movement packet. This movement packet contains many parts of data. However, the most important part is the location to which they are moving. This location packet, according to the exploit itself, can be set to what is now known as a NaN packet, or a not a number packet. Upon receiving a not a number packet, the server would freak out and instantaneously disconnect the player from the server itself. Upon logging back in, the server would not know where to place the player within the world, as the previous location had already been moved from, but the current location had not yet been moved to, leading to a glitch where the server could only place the player at the default location, world spawn, now commonly known as STP. And it would not take long before one group emerged that would happily take advantage of the power of this spot. The Valkyrians, a powerful group of players that had already risen to prominence, as they were a group formed entirely by the bonds they shared with their fellow 2b2t player. The Valkyrian dominance of STP in the latter half of 2013 will now be the backdrop of our story today. As STP had already become a widely known gathering place, not just for the Valkyrians, but also for other players as well, including the infamous POPBOB, it would not be too long before hostilities, both from POPBOB as well as other players, would become laser-focused upon STP. The initial problem, however, is that fighting at the site of STP was always foolish. At any time, for any reason, any number of players could appear at STP, and due to the earlier 1.5 minecart duplication exploit, many players were heavily armed and were itching for a fight. And so, on November 19th, 2013, the Valkyrian remnants that had fled with me to the lands all engaged in a proper skirmish with POPBOB. It started simply enough. One of my friends had openly stated in general chat that they were leaving and then departed for the STP site. This, of course, quickly gathered the attention of POPBOB himself. As soon as my friend was attacked, it would not be long before such an attack would be revisited with equal levels of aggression. Very quickly thereafter, I received word from my friends that the site of STP had become booby-trapped, and that players such as POPBOB and X0XP had been sighted in the area. This led all of us, except for myself, to mount an assault upon POPBOB at the STP site directly. POPBOB at this point was already planning for an attack. He had earlier discovered my famous base at the lands and raided part of the stash held there. And so the aggressions between my group and POPBOB were at an all-time high. The desire for revenge was very strong, and it was only a matter of time before such aggressions would boil over. As the assault took place, my friends and the Valkyrians were very quickly wiped out, as POPBOB, we would later find out, was wearing stacked armor. You see, the PvP meta of late 2013, back in those days, there was no quick way of finishing or flashily killing your opponent. It was a war of attrition, an absolute slugfest where both players wore down the armor of their opponent through repeated blows with the sword, and if they were lucky, their bows. However, the player who obtained the most armor prior to the fight was most likely to win, simply because they would last longer than their opponents. Gapples alone would not provide enough defense against a diamond sword if you were naked, and helmets and boots were often the first to break, leading to their defensive value not applying enough of a discount to the damage your opponent could then deal. And in an era where everyone was equally geared up with no common advantages to speak of, the one thing that determined your longevity was your armor quantity, which POPBOB had us all beaten in overwhelmingly. POPBOB was very quick to flex his advantage over everyone else, which is likely why he was so eager to engage us at STP, despite knowing that a reinforcement of any kind could appear at any time. This did not matter in his mind, but this oversight would cost him dearly. As the Valkyrians would repeatedly respawn at STP, POPBOB would just as quickly kill them, and they would just as quickly rearm themselves with vanilla diamond gear and re-teleport back to STP to repeat the entire fight all over again. At the time, I was afraid of being caught unaware, and I did not directly follow my compatriots to STP. Instead, I decided that I would reroute myself through the Nether, as the STP glitch would place me in the same coordinates as in the overworld, but in the Nether, and so I would be 8 times farther away from the overworld STP site where the fighting was taking place. But since this was all so close to spawn, I would still be able to close that distance pretty quickly. It would not be long before I could show up and back my friends up in the fight, as I was properly geared and ready for a long fight. I had just re-emerged back into the overworld and rounded a corner and crossed onto a giant obsidian pathway that had been laid out at spawn. There, before my very eyes, before I could even see the STP location, a peculiar message had popped up into the chat. A message that I'd almost overlooked, a death message. This simple death message was unlike all the other previous death messages that had filled my chat box to that point. The aggressor, who was once the victim, had now become the victor. And in that moment, POPBOB exploded like a piñata, forever losing his precious stacked armor. And as luck would have it, POPBOB had an internet outage of some point at that very moment, and it guaranteed our victory. I didn't even get the chance to move into the battle. Before my eyes, my friend, Exalted Spartans, who was the same friend who started this fight by traveling to STP in the first place, had dealt the final blow to POPBOB, not with a fancily named sword and not with some special god hack or any sort of insight or grand strategy, but with a plain Jane vanilla diamond sword. And for all the pomp and circumstance POPBOB had about him, it was a mere accident that claimed his life. The internet itself revolted against him, leaving his pride in tatters on the ground. He'd slayed my compatriots at least 100 times, and yet they did not give up. The prize was always POPBOB's armor. None of us could have predicted how that would all end. And then it led to an unbelievable tantrum that he would then pitch a few days later. Originally, POPBOB was so arrogant that he claimed to have never been killed by another player. Of course, evidence to the contrary did exist, but it really didn't matter, as no one is so good as to never be killed by another person. The most damning part about his statement was, even though anyone could immediately tell he was lying, was the fact that in his anger, POPBOB admitted to 3 other well-known players at the time having killed him, and then claimed that the attack and his subsequent defeat were all illegitimate, as though we had orchestrated this entire fight from the beginning, and that our grand plans were all for naught because he was about to patch our precious stacked plunder. It was just an accident, dude. And so, POPBOB eventually patched the stacked armor, but we managed to retain those few pieces for ourselves and renamed them the Alan POPBOB Project, as an homage to the name that he had come to be known as, Alan Schaefer. Although at the time we knew this was merely a meme name, as I don't believe anyone had yet doxed POPBOB. It was just a fun joke that we would constantly throw about. Eventually, POPBOB would employ his lightning exploit very soon, which is another story for another day. In part, his anger with us having defeated him, though POPBOB would go on to become an even greater threat in the future, we would never let him live it down. And so ends the tale of the defeat of POPBOB. And if you've liked what you've heard, please leave a like and subscribe. Leave a comment as well and join our Discord linked down below. And maybe even follow me on Twitter, as I occasionally shitpost there. And I greatly appreciate everyone who has managed to stick around and listen to all of my older stories. Oh, and POPBOB, if you're listening now, thanks for being you.